Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Today we are talking with Dan and Judy Dourson. Dan is a wildlife biologist, author, illustrator, and educator. Judy is an educator, author, editor, and researcher. Hi, Dan and Judy. Welcome to Backyard Ecology. Thank you for talking with us today.
Oh, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Nice to be here.
Yes.
Oh, I'm excited. So let's start out by telling everyone just a little bit about what you do, who you are, those basic introductory things.
So this is Judy, and I am a retired educator. I taught in the Powell County schools in the Red River Gorge in Kentucky for 28 years. Moved here from Ohio in the late 70s and fell in love with the area and came here for the nature. And during the course of that time, met Dan and became really involved with environmental education. And we've hosted. He sponsored wildflower weekends and herpetology weekends. So we've been really deeply involved in the education of the local area. We also jumped ship and ran a research station in the rainforest for 7 years, so in Belize. So we've had some really amazing experiences, but we're back in the Red River Gorge and still doing education.
Yeah, I originally came from Cincinnati down to the Red River Gorge area, and my, trip through life was a bit more complicated than Judy. When she went to school, got out and taught for 27 years, I bounced around doing everything from, I was a paramedic in Cincinnati to hiking the Pacific Crest Trail out west to going to school, which was hard for me because I had dyslexia. And so for going back to school was the last thing that I wanted to do, but I wanted to eventually work in the outdoors. So I went back to school, got a degree in biology, and ended up working for the U.S. Forest Service, a couple different places, a couple years in Texas on the Sam Houston National Forest. And then most of the time was spent on the Danube National Forest in eastern Kentucky. And I did a variety of things, but my passion has always been wildlife and animals, and more importantly, non-game species. In other words, species that aren't hunted for food or for sport. I was more interested in the support system, the animals and the plants that actually support the bigger animals. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell.
Yeah. And so I have to tell you this funny story. When I first met Dan and we were dating 26 years ago, I can remember being on the phone with him, and I was new to biology at that time. I'd love to learn, but just new to biology. And I was on the phone with him, and he said, "I'm sorry, I've got to go. The salamanders, the spotted salamanders are making bacon." And I can remember holding the phone up going, "What? What are you talking about?" And he went to explain to me that, in Eastern Kentucky, that means they're mating. And, that they were crossing the roads, and there's this elaborate mating dance and all this kind of stuff. But I knew I was on to somebody pretty unique and special when he... And weird. And but I stuck with it because I must have liked it.
That's a great story. I love that. And yeah, there's so many different things. You guys have done so much just from what you guys have told me, like off before we did the recording and also in the emails and stuff. And you've studied so many different things and so many different places. I mean, going to the rainforest here in the eastern US, just all sorts of different things. But a lot of your work lately has really focused on land snails. And that's what I want to talk to you guys a lot about today. But I know many of our listeners might be thinking, what? Land snails? What does that have to do with backyard ecology? Come on, Shannon. Aren't land snails just those things that eat our flowers and our veggies? And we'll get to some of that probably later on in the conversation. But before we get to that, I've got to ask, because I'm curious too, why land snails of all things? Because there's so many more charismatic creatures, and you guys have worked with some of them, but land snails, why? What drew you to them?
That's a really good question. And I get asked that a lot. And 25 years ago, I couldn't answer. If somebody had asked me that, I said, well, they're interesting, but I really couldn't explain why. Today, I can, because I've studied snails for 25 years now. And what I have found is that they are definitely the underdogs of the world. and they're the building blocks of the ecosystem. In other words, they kind of support everything else that we consider more important to our lives, like the bigger animals and stuff like that. But it turns out that land snails are important because, for example, they've done studies in Europe where they've seen bird populations decline that are directly tied to land snail populations declining. So if there's acid rain, which affects the snail's ability to reproduce and build the shell, because the shell basically is made out of calcium carbonate, that resource to a female bird is now gone because, and the resource being the calcium carbonate in the shell. So the female birds, before they lay eggs, go out and hunt snails and snail shells for the protein and the calcium carbonate. They eat the shells and it gives them a boost, kind of like when we feed chickens oyster shells to thicken up their egg shells. Same thing with wild birds. They look for wild snail shells to eat. They eat these and it builds a stronger egg. So when they lay it and sit on it, it doesn't break. If they don't have that calcium carbonate source from the snail shell because of a declining population of snails, then their eggshells are thinner. And when the female bird sits on the egg, it fractures and they lose that reproductive success for that year. We are seeing that in the US as well. We're seeing where populations of land snails are declining, and native birds like the wood thrush is also declining as well. And even in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, at high elevations where the acid precipitation is higher, we're seeing land snail populations decline, and birds that require that snail shell for the calcium carbonate boost are also declining with those snail declines. So that's it in a nutshell. And that's just one example of actually tens of thousands of examples of how land snails support other organisms, from snakes to birds to bats. There are bats that actually eat land snails. From wild turkeys and grouse for the same reason, they're eating the snail shell for the calcium carbonate boost, to small mammals. So all kinds of to crocodiles. In Belize, the Morlack crocodile which is endangered. 75% of its diet are these big apple snails, these aquatic apple snails the size of oranges. And without that, the Morlack crocodile declines. So one species like snails can cause the decline of many other species.
Yeah, you were mentioning the crocodiles in Belize eating the snails. There's also a similar connection in Florida with the snail kites.
That's correct. Yeah. So Florida, it's interesting you should mention that. There are species of birds that have evolved. Their beaks have evolved to be much more curved and longer so that they can reach into the aperture of the snail, the opening of the snail, in ways that no other animal can. So if the snail, like the apple snail in the Florida Everglades, was to disappear because of pollution, and that is a problem down there. And so there's some really interesting relationships between snails and some of them are very specific and more than others, of course.
And one of the things that really stood out to me, because you sent me some stuff to read, which was very informative, very interesting. But one of the things it was talking about was that, and it was just like one sentence, but it said that firefly larvae ate snails.
Yeah.
And that really stood out to me because I've always loved fireflies. I'm still the person that when the first fireflies show up in the spring, I have to run out and go look at them. I don't care how old I am. I will probably always be doing that. This spring, I would like to have somebody on to talk more about fireflies. I know that fireflies are predators as larvae. They're living in the ground, but I'd always thought of it as more of like them eating nematodes, maybe some small beetle larvae. So when I read that they ate snails, I was like, wow, how does that work? Can you shed some more light? Because that's just cool and interesting to me because I do love fireflies so much.
Yeah, what we find out as biologists, the more we study animals, especially what I call the lesser majority, the lesser creatures, but they're the majority of the biodiversity on the planet. And what we find is that most animals are opportunistic feeders. In other words, they don't just feed on one thing. A good example, squirrels. We think of squirrels as eating nuts, but they also eat baby birds. They eat bird eggs. They eat a number of insects and other things that we wouldn't normally associate a squirrel diet with. And so that's true with a lot of animals, including invertebrates like firefly larvae. They feed on a variety of things. And it just so happens if they're moving along the ground where snails live and they come across the snail, they'll go after it and they actually go into the opening or the aperture of the snail and eat it alive. I mean, it sounds pretty gruesome, but but it's just how it works. And so, and the other thing, one of the questions you asked me, I wanted to touch just briefly on why I study snails. Just to give you an idea, if you were to look at an animal diversity chart, only 5% of the animals on the planet, on the entire planet, are vertebrates. In other words, animals with spines like we are. So that would include like mammals, birds, snakes, lizards, crocodiles, turtles, salamanders, frogs, and fish are vertebrates. That's only 5% of the animal biodiversity. 95%, the rest of what's on the planet, are actually invertebrates, things without spines. And 11% of that are mollusks, or things like clams and mussels and snails and octopuses and squids. That's 11% of the biodiversity, far more than the 5% of the mammals, the ones that we spend the most money and the time appreciating. It's so that the 95% is what supports the entire system. And without it, it just falls apart. It collapses.
I always use as an example a Jenga game. You can start to pull out one piece here and a piece there, but if you start pulling out all the supports, eventually the system collapses.
Yeah. You could remove all the bald eagles in the U.S. and it would have absolutely no effect on the ecosystem, or very little, because they're really mostly a scavenger animal anyway. But if you were to remove all the snails or all the bats or all the snakes, the system would just implode. It would just fall apart, because these animals are far more important to the ecosystem than things like bald eagles.
And I love that Jenga analogy. I'm going to have to borrow that.
You're more than welcome to.
Yes, because I've used other analogies, but I like that one. That one fits much better, I think. That one's a good one. And it is, like you said, so true once you start removing those different things. Let's kind of back up a little bit, because I'm sure we've got listeners, and I'm thinking of one or two in particular who I know personally, who are probably going right now, wait a minute, I didn't even know there were different types of snails, but we're talking about diversity and stuff like that. So most of our listeners are primarily in the eastern U.S. What kind of numbers do we have here? Can you give us an idea of how many different types of snails that we have?
Yeah, in the eastern U.S., which is the richest land snail fauna in North America, we have probably just over 500 species, maybe approaching 600 species at this point. We're still finding new species every day. We always think of the rainforest as the only place we're going to find new species to science, but that's not true. We are, in fact, finding new species every year in the eastern U.S., not just land snails, but many other species as well, mostly invertebrates, things without spines. But if you go to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park website and type in Discover Life in America, the ATBI project, it discovered literally thousands of new species to science within the park boundary within the last 15, 20 years. And so there are a lot of species. In Kentucky here, we have about 200 species of land snails. You can go to one hillside here in Powell County where Judy and I live, and just within 5 acres, you can find over 65 species of land snails on one hillside.
Oh, wow.
within 5 acres. That's amazing. I mean, most people will say, well, there's a few species, but in fact, there's many, many species, and they range in size from the size of a pinhead as an adult to things that are the size of a silver dollar. So there are many, many different kinds of species.
Bernheim Forest near Louisville now has cataloged 82 species within their boundaries.
Yeah, and that's just right outside a major city there with Louisville.
Yes.
Yep.
In fact, one of the things that's real interesting is right now there's an energy company that's wanting to build a pipeline or something through Bernheim Forest. And one of the ways that they're trying to prevent that is a very rare snail that was just recently documented at 3 sites there. So,
Well, Judy and I just finished up a statewide survey in Kentucky that was funded by the
Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves.
Yes, and it included a bunch. We did some training courses to a bunch of biologists across the state. So it was a group effort. And in that effort, we found over 1,700 new county records. We found 10 species new to the state, new state records. And we are looking at maybe 8 to 10 species that are completely new to science, unknown to science.
I got to also put in a plug. It wasn't just biologists. So this was a project that also involved citizen science. That was a really important component of it. We had over 100 participants across the state that collected snails, sent them to us to identify. So it really added a lot to the knowledge base of the snail fauna of the state. And the report that we're working on right now will be sent to the nature preserves, but it'll also be useful for land managers. We also document exotics, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, in a little while. I'm sure you're going to have questions about inviting snails into their backyard, but it does discuss that.
You don't have to invite them; they're already there.
No.
But those are exotic snails, so
Right.
we'll talk about that.
We'll talk about that. But, it was a really terrific effort and modeled actually after another statewide survey that was conducted in West Virginia. And, we feel like this is the way to go. It's really great when you can conduct workshops with people who are interested in nature. They learn about the animals and they come away with a whole new appreciation, again, like he says, for the underdogs.
And, the great thing about land snail conservation and research is that it's inexpensive as compared to doing surveys for bats. Like I used to survey for bats, and bat survey is very expensive. You have to have, research permits, scientific permits. You have to, with the white nose syndrome that's killing most of our eastern bats now, there's all these protocols to protect the bats. So there's a lot of work. Or if you're out there netting for birds, the same kind of thing, or small mammals. With land snails, you can take somebody that's 5 years old, 6 years old, on up to 70, and you can go out and within 30 minutes, you can teach them how to collect snails. And the thing is, most of what you find are just the shells. 95% of what you pick up are just snail shells. So not only are you not having to deal with live animals like bats and birds, which can be problematic, you're just picking up the shells. You're not hurting the live animals in any way. And you can collect these shells, put them in a bag, and put some information on it, and be part of this scientific study, which is what has happened here in Kentucky.
Right. Well, the other thing that is interesting is if you go into anybody's house, people are fascinated with shells. Mostly they're the seashells because that's what they're familiar with. But you can go just about anybody's house that has traveled to the beach and find a little collection of shells. So that part isn't so hard to get people interested in. And I know that people, as they hike, if they're people that spend time outdoors, will see snail shells and probably wonder about them. So our books, and then we've also developed an identification card through this project that helps people identify them from the species to genus. And again, one of the things that is our mission is we feel like you only protect what you learn to love. Mm-hmm. You can only learn to love it if you can give it a name. If I see somebody on the street and I don't know their name, I'm going to say, have some sort of a feeling for them. But if I know your name, and then I start to know a little bit about you, I'm going to care about you a lot more. And that's our mission, is to get people to kind of care about things by knowing.
Yeah. And I completely agree with everything that you said. I mean, I love citizen science, community science. Even though this is one of our early episodes, anybody that's listened to the earlier episodes knows we're going to be talking citizen science, community science a lot. It's a theme that kind of runs through this whole thing. And I love the fact that with the land snails, it is something that we can all do, because like you said, if we go for a hike, or as we've alluded to already, but probably talk about in a few minutes more, they're in our yards, they're in our communities. We don't have to go to the rainforest to go study them. And there's cool things here that we don't even know about because they're new to science. Nobody's really identified them. But kind of talking about that identification, because it's kind of run through and we've touched on it a few times. How do you tell one species from another? I mean, is this something like we can just look at it and tell? Do we have to look at genitalia? Because I know that's true with some organisms. Can we take a picture, put it to iNaturalist? Where do we go with this? How do we tell?
Right. So I'm going to talk first, because when I was still teaching school, I used snails as a way to teach basic science concepts like the science process, and used it for children to teach identification and observation skills. So one of the things that I would do is talk about the snails, and it's easy to help people relate to something that they're familiar with. So snails have some interesting things that they share with humans. Snails have umbilicus, which is a belly button, and snails either have innies or outies, or a little bit in between. And there's technical terms for those, but that's one way you can tell them apart, is by you flip them over and look at the hole, or the umbilicus, the belly button of a snail. They also have lips, which is also called the periostome. It's a fancy name for it.
Yeah, just lips.
Yeah, just lips. Or not lips, so that it's a part of it that is reflected and is kind of white and shiny. If it doesn't have that, it's...
Wow, some snail species are lipless, and other ones have full
like look like they've had collagen or
Yeah.
what is it, that Botox.
Botox
Yeah.
injected.
And injected
And we're talking about the shell.
on the shell.
On the shell.
Mhm.
Opening is.
Yeah, so these are all shell characteristics. So most snails are identified mostly by their shell characteristics. However, Dan can talk a little bit more about in the science realm, when you get into like determining new species, many times to separate them, you have to do DNA sequencing or genitalia work. But for most snail shells, you can identify them by the shell.
You can.
And
most people, if they have a decent yard with, especially if the yard has an area where it's not mowed within an inch of its life. So kind of an area where they put brush or leaf piles or stuff like that. Most yards of that type will have about a dozen species of snails in it. Now, that said, a portion of those will be exotic. And this is the thing about, I'm sure some of your listeners are saying, I don't want snails in my yard. And I can understand that, because if you're growing a garden, which Judy and I do, the kind of slugs and shelled snails that you see in your garden generally are not native, but exotic, mostly from Europe or Asia. So if you go in your backyard and after a rain in the springtime, when the temperatures are above 50 to 60 degrees, and you see a lot of slugs, like dozens and dozens of slugs, 9 times out of 10, those are going to be exotic snails. And a slug is a snail. And just to be clear, a slug is not a snail that crawled out of its shell. You're either a slug that never develops a shell, or you're a shelled snail that has, of course, a shell that grows with your body. So that's that. Getting back to the exotic slugs. So if you see a lot of these in your backyard after a warm, rainy night, then 9 times out of 10, they're going to be exotic slugs. It's on very rare occasions that it's a native slug. You actually have to look hard to find native slugs. And generally, the only place you can find native slugs is out in a forested area that's intact, that's not beat up or cut over or so forth, but, degraded basically. So slugs in your backyard are almost 100% exotic. Slugs in the woods, a good intact forest, are native. If you go out into the woods and you look for native slugs, they're hard to find, and you would be hard pressed to find 5 or 6 native slugs in 4 or 5 acre woodlot. That would be really difficult. That said, there are still native snails in your backyard, and most of them are going to be very small, like 4 to 5 millimeters. So if you're like me, you have to get down on your hands and knees and wear glasses. But if you're a little kid, you've got really good eyes, you're low to the ground, and you can find these things pretty easy.
So back to the identification. So lips, umbilicus, and they either have teeth or no teeth. So the teeth are actually on the shell as well. They aren't chompy things like we have, but they are like calcium protrusions that help identify the snails. So some of them are very intricate. Some of the real small ones have intricate placement of these teeth, but it's also how you identify them. You also identify them by the number of spirals, which is called whorls. So you can count those, and textures of the snail also, and sometimes color. In the eastern U.S., there aren't a lot of super colorful ones.
The tiger snails.
There's some that are, and the tiger snail is one of them that we sent you a picture of, and it's one of the prettier ones. Dan, when we were dating, had earrings made from those for me, so because they were pretty.
And it is a very pretty snail. In fact, I'm going to use that for the episode picture for this. So anybody that wants to see this pretty snail that we're talking about, go to the show notes. If your listening app doesn't have different episode pictures for everything, but it is in the show notes.
Okay.
You were talking the umbilicus, the belly button. Where's that on the snail shell?
Yes.
So if you're walking along the woods and you see a snail crawling, it's on the bottom. So if you pick up the snail and turn it over, that's where the belly button is, or the umbilicus.
Right.
So this would be on the bottom behind the opening? Okay.
And usually if you think about a snail shell, you'll see the top part of it is the part where you see all the swirls, like the spiral.
To the side of the opening.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So there's a couple things here I could go over, just kind of the bullet statements. Do you want me to do that?
Go ahead if you want.
Okay, so globally, there's about 85,000 species of mollusks that are living today, described. And of those, of course, land snails are part of that bigger family called mollusks. And they're related to squids, which are considered one of the fastest animals on the planet. Octopuses are also distantly related to snails, and are considered one of the most clever and smartest animals on the planet. There's fluorescent land snails. The snail that you're going to show on your website, the tiger snail. Actually, if you were to take it out and a live one, and take a UV light, they actually fluoresce under UV light.
Oh, cool.
Which is really cool.
The slime.
The slime does.
Yeah.
Okay. So do they leave a trail?
They do.
Yes, they do.
So they leave this glowing trail through the woods. And, oh, that'd be so cool.
Yeah, with the UV.
I'm going to have to get a black light and start looking.
And also the black light's good for looking for scorpions and millipedes. They also fluoresce under UV light. That's not to be mistaken with bioluminescence, which is, the actual glowing, like fireflies or bioluminescence.
Right.
So that's a very different thing that you're seeing.
I have to tell you that the fluorescence in that species of snails was accidentally discovered. Somebody was doing another project in a museum, went into a room, was storing specimens from another collection, and had the black light, and noticed that a collection of live snails preserved in formaldehyde were, fluorescing under this UV light. And
after 25
years sitting on the shelf.
Oh, wow.
So one of the things we've done is tried to make, we've tried it with other species, but there's a group of that genus and one other genus where some of them do. And it pretty much works for that genus. So that's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
A couple other things. Snails have defenses. If you're a shelled snail with a shell, that's your first line of defense. Works well against most animals, but not birds that are looking for you, that are going to eat you, or small mammals like shrews. They're going to basically chew through the shell and get to the flesh that way. But for smaller invertebrates, it works very well. For slugs, they're not defenseless. They basically have a defensive slime or mucus that, if irritated, they produce this. And I've tasted it before, and it turns your mouth numb. So I don't recommend this, but it does work very well.
Why? I'm just going to ask. Why?
Well,
because he tastes everything.
Because I'm a biologist, and if you're out there and you really want to experience your surroundings and the things that you're studying, I use all my senses, including taste. So I've tasted frogs and other things. I've tasted, the defense chemicals that they use, and just I want to understand and what other animals sense and taste when they attack a frog or a snail or a slug. And so that's why I do it.
Well, not only is he dyslexic, he's colorblind. And so as a biologist, he's got to overcompensate for that part of his senses.
Oh, is that what it is? Overcompensating? Okay. I've heard.
Okay, I've got to say though, I don't recommend tasting the critters to most of our listeners here, especially the younger crowds.
What it did when I've done that with different slugs and snails, it turns your mouth numb. It's really interesting sensation. So if you need some Novocaine, lick a slug. Anyway, so we talked about fluorescent. The diet of most snails and slugs is interesting because they're called detritivores, and detritus is, if you go out into the woods and you scrape off the dry leaf cover on top of the ground, you get down to a layer called detritus, which is the decaying leaf matter, leaves, and plants that are dying and so forth. They are in this layer called the detritus zone. This is what most snails and slugs eat, is the detritus. Mm-hmm. So that's important because snails, as they eat detritus, they're recycling nutrients through their system back into the ecosystem and providing nutrients for plants to grow and grow better. And they also, in the process, they're dispersing things like slime mold spores and fungi mold, because slugs love fungi. And slugs are even able to eat things like the destroying angel, amanitas, that are deadly to us and everything else that eats it, except slugs. And slugs will eat a destroying angel mushroom, and they'll sequester the toxins that are in that poisonous mushroom. And that's what they use in their mucus as a defense. So I probably shouldn't be licking, that kind of stuff. But in any case, they have an interesting diet.
Yeah, I was going to say, that was one of the things I wanted to really talk to you about, was the diet of the snails. Mm-hmm. Because I'm used to just kind of thinking of, okay, snails eat vegetation type stuff, whether it's detritus or green growing vegetation.
Mhm.
They eat fungi, they eat algae, depending on where they're at.
Mhm.
But I'm kind of looking at them as eating those sorts of things in my mind. But the information you sent me, I was reading, was saying that they also can eat animal poop, scat,
Yep.
or carrion dead animals. Is that like all over the world that they do that? Or do we have species here in the eastern US that do that as well?
Oh yeah, we have. I've gotten really good pictures of snails in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park feeding on bear dung.
Oh, wow.
And they'll eat all kinds of dung. They'll eat the mold filaments that grow from like eastern Allegheny wood rat dung.
Oh, wow.
So they eat a variety of things. And like I said before, most animals we're finding as we study, especially the small things like the invertebrates, we're finding that they're opportunistic feeders. So in other words, they kind of feed on what's in their environment. And of course, the home range of any snail or slug is going to be, it could be as small as just a few square meters. And so what's in that home range is what they're consuming. And it can be a variety of things.
Yeah, we found them on skulls that have been out in the woods where they're gleaning the calcium off of the skull. We did a 2-year study in West Virginia about an endangered snail in West Virginia, the three-tooth. One of the things we studied was the feeding habits. We actually published a paper about that, and we documented, I don't know how many things.
28
different food sources, including blossoms of rhododendron that had fallen and that were decaying. And like you said, the fungi that grows off of wood rat scat looks like cotton candy. It's crazy looking. And just a variety of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool and interesting as we get into thinking about what all they eat. Earlier in the conversation, you mentioned that there was a rare species in Bernheim, and you just mentioned an endangered species. How many endangered or threatened species, rare species, do we have? I mean, are there a bunch?
In Kentucky or the eastern U.S. or both?
Both.
So in Kentucky, the state has a list of what they call conservation species, rare and endangered and threatened. And in Kentucky, I would say for land snails, there's probably a dozen species that are considered endangered. But since this new project that we just completed, we are going to be adding quite a few more to the list. So
it's looking upwards around 25 to 30 that are going to be what we consider the S1, S2 species.
Oh, wow.
In Kentucky.
And then in the eastern U.S., there's quite a few more, mostly situated around the Smoky Mountains National Park. So when you look at endemism, which is something that's endemic, means that it's something that has a very small range. Like, for example, in Kentucky, we have one snail that's endemic to Kentucky, and it's called the Patera estoensis. And I'm trying to think of the common name. I think it's called, but anyway, it's truly endemic. It's known only from Estill County.
He named it.
And it's only known from these limestone hills in one small portion of Estill County, eastern Kentucky. So that's an endemic. We don't have a lot of endemic snails to Kentucky, although after this report is all said and done, we're going to add a few more. But the highest level of endemism is around Tennessee and North Carolina along the border where the Great Smoky Mountains National Park occurs. And the reason the endemism is so high down there, and it's not just for snails, but also for salamanders, for slime molds, mushrooms, and mosses and liverworts. There's all kinds of species that find their high levels of endemism in that region, is because it has high elevations up to about 6,500 feet from valley floors that are around 1,500 feet. So you have a great range of elevation. And then you also, in the higher elevations, you have these isolated peaks within the Southern Appalachian Mountains that are like islands of endemic species. So they're found on one mountaintop, but not the one next to it, which might be just a mile away, because they're isolated by cooler, higher elevation. So down there are many, many species that are listed as threatened or endangered, and many endemic species to the park as well. And I would say well over 40 or 50 species that are considered highly endemic and highly endangered within that region.
Ooh, I've got something to say. It made me think about, this is sort of random. Did you know that snails can fly?
Wait, what? No.
Oh.
Did you know that snails can fly? Not really. They don't flap their wings. But one of the studies that the micro snails that are less than 5 millimeters, some of them have been documented. There are some species that occur here that also occur in Belize in the rainforest. And
So yeah, that is really, I know it comes across as very strange. How's that even possible? So what we learned is that there are small species that even in your backyard, probably your backyard, that occurs on mountaintops in southern Belize and the Maya Mountains, which is, several thousand miles away at least.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And we now know that
They hitchhike.
They hitchhike on birds, and that's how they fly. So we have what we call neotropical birds here that, like the warblers, like the Kentucky warbler, that is here in Kentucky in the summertime. It comes here to breed and nest and have its young, raise its young. And then come winter or late fall, early winter, they migrate back to Central America and Belize, and they winter there. And these birds collectively are called neotropical birds. And there's many, many species. Well, these birds we now know eat snails. And we also know that some of these snails can survive the gut. As an example, a Kentucky warbler here in Kentucky eats some snails it finds on the ground, these little snails. It then migrates to Central America, like Belize, and these snails survive and are then pooped out into the mountains of the Maya. And they survive and they thrive and they have done very well down.
Bird wings.
What's that?
Bird wings too. Right?
Bird wings. Some snails are known to crawl up onto bird wings while they're sleeping at night. Others would be hitched rides on logs and through flood events. So if we have a big flash flood and a lot of debris wash down into the creeks, into the rivers, those rivers eventually get down into the Gulf of Mexico.
And they can survive.
And there's snails that survive on those debris, those log rafts basically, that then end up in places like Central and maybe as far south as South America.
Yeah. Anyway,
that was really cool. Some interesting stuff.
Yeah,
that is really cool. But it also brings back in that Jenga analogy. I mean, you take out bits and pieces.
Yep.
I mean, even the birds, they're helping to disperse the snails. And I'm sure it's not. The bird digestive system works multiple times between here and Belize or Central America.
Right.
So I'm sure it's not just one big jump. It's little steps along the way that it would take to do.
So we haven't talked about reproduction yet. Do you want to talk about reproduction? Because it's probably the most interesting aspect of snails and why I study them.
Go for it.
Okay, so reproduction is really interesting with most land snails. And we have, in Kentucky, we have a couple species of slugs, native slugs, that carry love darts. And what's the line that you use all the time about love darts?
So when I learned about these love darts, these things are calcareous daggers, literally, that the slug will thrust into its mate to stimulate copulation. And when I found that out, I was like, oh my gosh, Cupid does exist. It's in the world of land snails. Because
it is. So you have, to back up a bit, many snails are hermaphrodites, which means they have both sexes, both male and female. And in some rare cases, if you put one snail out in the middle of the woods and come back 20 years later, there's a whole population, because that one snail, because it was a hermaphrodite and could self-impregnate, could produce eggs and offspring. But in most cases, you have two snails of the same species that are crawling along and they meet each other, or one's crawling along and another one finds its slime trail and senses it and then follows it. They meet each other and they exchange sperm, and they're now both fertile. And at some point, and it could be right away, or it could be weeks or months later, when conditions are right, which are moist, warm conditions, they lay eggs, which for most species are the size of BBs or smaller, and they're kind of clear. So they go into the woods and they go under some leaf litter or under a moist log, and they lay a little clutch of eggs. These eggs then hatch out, and they are replicas, when they hatch out, replicas of the adults, just very, very small, with maybe one whorl, and that's it, not multiple whorls. But as they grow, the shell grows with them, and they add on additional whorls.
So they're not like one of the hermit crabs on the beach. They don't outgrow their shell and then go look for another one.
No, not at all. But the love darts is really interesting, because there are some species that actually will jab their partner once, and that's enough to stimulate copulation. And there are other species that will repeat the jabs as much as 100 or 200 times. And they find that the ones that are the most repetitive jabbers are the ones that have the highest reproductive success. So anyway, it's
Yeah.
pretty interesting stuff, and
Not in all species.
not in all species.
It actually is, though, in the species that people would commonly think of as a food source for people that is not native to the U.S. It's from Europe. The helix.
Escargot, the one that we eat.
Escargot, they actually carry love darts. That species does.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they're big jabbers, so they like to jab a lot.
One other thing about the snail eggs that is interesting, I think, is there's some research being conducted on the snail eggs because they have a coating or something that is antimicrobial, and so it's being studied as perhaps for an antibiotic.
Well, they think, you know how our antibiotics are failing us now because we have both used them in meat production and so forth, and overused them in humans as well. So they're not working as well, and they think, the many scientists that are studying the slime of certain species of snail think the next generation of antibiotics for humans may come from snails. So there are many human reasons to protect snails and like snails. Oh, well, you can tell them about the biobomb.
So another thing that's really cool that it relates to humans is in South America, people are raising snails and harvesting the slime to make a cream called biobomb. And you can buy this online. And the snail slime, because snails actually can repair their shells and can repair their damage to their skin. They have regenerative properties. So
they rarely, snails, mollusks in general, rarely get cancer or any kind of degenerative type disease because of their ability to self-heal with these compounds that are found in their mucus.
So there's places in South America, it's been shown to really improve severe scarring, like from acne or burn victims. Mm-hmm. And it really helps repair skin on humans. So there's a market now for harvesting the slime of snails.
And Ripley's, believe it or not, you can go to places and actually, like these spas where they have these giant snails that crawl on your face.
Yeah.
And basically this is what, and people pay money to do this. They have these snails crawl over their face and skin, and it repairs damaged skin. And it's thought
evidently it works, because when we lived in Belize, our staff were Mayan, and one of the girls there had some discoloration on her face. And I went in her room one day, and she had this little jar of cream, and it said crema de caracol, and that's caracol is Spanish for snail. And so she had snail cream.
I told her, don't spend any more money on that cream. I'll go out in the jungle, and I'll get you some live snails, and just lay down, and we'll just let them crawl on your face. It'll be much more potent, much more effective. She didn't want to do that.
She didn't do that.
I don't know why.
So is it, I mean, I've got to think that different snails would have different chemicals in their slime. So
yes.
Does it matter what snail it is that you're letting crawl on, or harvesting the slime? I'd be more likely to harvest the slime than let it crawl on my face.
Yeah.
I'm not sure
it's
what
still,
the species is.
Yeah, there's still a lot of science to be discovered when it comes to the properties of the mucus. Mm-hmm. And there are thousands of species. So it's hard to say. Yeah, I mean, some are shown to be more potent than others. Yeah. And have different attributes.
So I probably shouldn't go out in my backyard, grab a snail, and just stick it on my forehead or something.
You get online and do a little research, find out. I would opt for the cream. I think that's probably what I would do.
That's more proven.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. But if you had like a little skin cancer spot, you might grab a native slug or something like that and let it crawl over it.
It wouldn't hurt.
You know, there's people in Europe, actually, one thing they're doing is because of this antimicrobial properties of the mucus. And this is actually they call it zootherapy, the use of animals like leeching, like leeches are used to drain blood of reattached fingers. Mm-hmm. And there's, lots of examples of that. People are actually eating live slugs in Europe to cure ulcers.
I know, it sounds gross. That can't be cured
by any other method. And they have to be eaten live, because when you eat a live slug, when it hits your stomach acid, it reacts by producing copious amounts of mucus, which is said to cure the ulcer.
I would have to have a pretty darn bad ulcer to swallow a live slug.
I mean, if nothing,
you like slugs.
Yeah, if nothing else is working.
I'm with you, Judy. Okay, with the snails, we've lined up all kinds of great reasons for how they play important roles in the ecosystem. We've talked about just from being eaten and the roles that they play there, but also helping with bringing nutrients back into the ecosystem, things that people can do with them, from putting them on their skin or whatever. Probably not licking them,
Yeah.
but
People eat snails.
some people eat snails. But if somebody wanted to make their yards better for snails, even just to be able to increase the different cogs, the different Jenga pieces in their backyard ecosystem, any hints or ideas for how to do that?
Yeah. It's funny. Humans, we like everything manicured, our yards mowed within an inch of their life. And while that's appealing to us, it isn't to wildlife. And so the single best thing you can do in your backyard, maybe you can't do this in the front yard because there are restrictions and so forth, but most people backyards are more off limits when it comes to that kind of stuff. So the thing to do is just let a portion of your backyard grow wild. And the more of that, the bigger proportion that you can do that with, the more kinds of things, not just snails, but toads and birds and small mammals and things of that sort will start to occupy your yard. And you raise plants.
Mm-hmm.
One of the best things you can do is native plant conversion. So do away with what I consider boring grass and establish these amazing wildflower prairies with native grasses and native flowers that attract insect pollinators, bees and butterflies.
The other thing that's interesting, though, that's kind of off topic as far as managing in your backyard, but places to look if you have these kind of things for snails, you've got a pile of rocks around, or even up against the foundation of your house. The snails they're looking for calcium. So any place that has calcium can potentially be a place to look. We've even found snails. One of the places we target when we do our surveys is we go into these small towns and look for abandoned parking lots. And there's like moss and kind of vegetation, little
unkept areas.
Yeah. And we have found 10 or 12 different species in an old abandoned parking lot. So yeah. They're in a lot of places you wouldn't expect. And I guess my point is, that you can find them around your house in places you wouldn't even imagine.
And Judy makes a good point. Leaving wood piles or like a pile of rocks or debris or anything like that. Leave that, put it towards the back of your yard. And those provide habitat, not just for land snails, but for, like I said, frogs and salamanders and all kinds of things.
Yeah. So in our yard, we have a section that we mow, but we also have lots of, native prairies and things like that. And when we cut brush down, we pile it in a pile, and that provides habitat for birds in the winter, and just a lot of different things. So, there's a lot of things you can do even in a small area to attract animals. And like he said, if you build it for other things, the snails will come.
Oh, yeah, they'll be there.
Yeah, and that's nice too when you can do these multi-layer. Well, you're creating an ecosystem basically in your yard.
Yes.
And what you're doing for the pollinators is helping not just the butterflies, but the bees, all the different types of pollinators, but that's also helping the birds, it's helping the snails. When you make the brush piles, the rock piles, it's helping the snails, but it's also helping the birds, it's helping like you said, the reptiles, the amphibian, everything. So I really like that when they're all just kind of comes together. You don't have to do something new. We've all got too much going on.
Right. Exactly.
That's the great thing about mowing your lawn. Takes time. let not mowing it doesn't take any time.
Right.
It's great. It's a win-win situation. Mm-hmm. And after a year or two of not mowing and sowing some native seed in there and debris, take some lounge chairs back there and watch the show. Right. It is amazing, what you're going to see. The dragon, if you have a water source is even better. If you can put a water feature back there, it just increases the diversity so much more. Dragonflies, which eat mosquitoes, and salamanders breed in there, and you can listen to the frogs in the springtime. It's a show. It's better than TV.
Yeah.
Oh, I fully agree.
Right. But, awesome. We've even seen in the cities, one of the things that I have noticed is a lot of people are, one of the things we've got are raised beds for our gardens, and we made them out of concrete and stuff. So even if you are in an area where you're more restricted, for the mowing, you can do some raised beds, you can still organize it in a way that looks attractive to your neighbors, but still provides habitat too.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I'm hoping to have people on and other shows that are really going to I want to flesh this out more and have more ways to create that habitat in our yards that is acceptable to our neighbors as well as to ourselves.
Yeah.
That works for everyone and everything.
It does.
Yeah, we could stay on here forever, I think, and talk for several hours.
Yeah, exactly.
We should probably think about wrapping this up sometime, but is there anything else that you would like to share with us?
Just the adventure into land snails has been, wonderful for both of us. It's given us a lot of enjoyment. We've done a lot of educational workshops and materials. We've, in Belize, studied them. He studied them for 10 years and wrote a book about them, described 17 new species to science down there, and have tour guides that are interested now in talking about them, and have done workshops for that. And so that's been, a really exciting and fun part of our journey. And
if you're interested, I think the only book available, I've written a couple, like she said, on land snails in the States, but the only one that I think is in print is The Land Snails of West Virginia.
Yeah, it can be found on if you go to the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources website, they have copies that tells you how you can get them. Another thing I would say is that if the listeners, are interested in learning to identify, you mentioned iNaturalist, that is a good place to go. There are snail experts on there that go on and do identify. We're so busy, we find that it's very difficult to find the time to go through and identify on iNaturalist. So if anybody is interested in knowing what their snails are, they can contact us. I think you're going to have the website. We'd be happy to, they can send us photos. We do have some of those land snail cards for Kentucky available. So if you're in Kentucky and you want to send us a message, we could probably arrange to get you a copy of
this thing here
of the snail card. In fact, we'll definitely send you one, Shannon, for sure.
That's awesome. Thank you. I was going to say me.
And then
and we have some left from the project.
It's laminated too.
Right. And so people are interested in that, we can definitely get them those. So those were produced with a grant from the state. So it would only be, shipping, I can throw that in an envelope. That's not going to be that expensive.
Just to add, the West Virginia book does work for the states that surround West Virginia, including Kentucky. So
for the most part,
yeah.
So, it is useful. The Kentucky book is being revised at this point and will be hopefully available this time next year through University Press of Kentucky. And anyway, we've written a few other books too on stuff that isn't about land snails.
Oh yeah, you guys have done so much. We might have to talk about having you guys on again to talk about other things.
Oh.
That would be fun.
Sure.
Yeah, so I will definitely put links to everything that you sent me in the show notes, your email address and stuff, so people can contact you. And I do encourage all of our listeners to go to the show notes and look at these links because they've got some amazing stuff there.
Thanks.
And once the Kentucky book is published, if you remember, you send me a link to it.
Certainly.
I'll update the show notes and put that in there too, because people may be listening to this after it's been published.
Yeah, certainly. We'd be glad to. The project in Kentucky is concluded as far as our obligation for it, but that doesn't mean we're not still interested in snails that they find. So again, they can contact us if they want to send us specimens. Yeah. We're happy to do that because we will continue to work with the nature preserves to continue to update their database. And it's crazy. The snail the styleri, the one that the greenbrier tiger snail, literally sat on the shelf for 20 years in a biologist's office before it got in our hands and Dan identified it. So, you know what? You might find something new. So, send us snails.
The ending I would add is that, going out in the woods and looking for snails or other things, wild edible plants or whatever, it kind of slows down our frequently overstimulated lifestyle and fast-paced lifestyle. So going out and taking time to turn a log over to look for salamanders or snails or millipedes. It's just a great way to just slow your life down and enjoy nature. And if you have kids love this kind of stuff.
It's like
this is what kids are made of. Kids
are
made.
A treasure hunt.
I mean, if you were to open a kid up, they're full of wonder. They're full of snails and salamanders and tadpoles. That's what they're made of.
Right.
So I would encourage everybody to go out and take the time to just look and listen.
And so winter is actually
not lick though. Don't lick slugs.
Winter's actually a great time to do that. Is going out into the woods. You can take a stick and scrape back the leaf litter, look under logs, base of rocks and stuff like that. And especially if you're in any areas around limestone, you'll find snail shells. So it's one of the things I always thought was fun, because in the winter, people who are naturalists and stuff, we sort of get squirrely because there's not a lot out right now, especially plants. So it's a really good way to connect in nature.
Yeah, and you don't have to go to the ocean to find really cool shells. They're right in our backyard.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, it was fun.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. I appreciate Dan and Judy taking time to talk with us today. I had so much fun geeking out and learning about land snails from them. And I know, land snails aren't the most charismatic organism in our yards and communities, so it would be easy to just write them off and ignore them. But as Dan and Judy pointed out, they are extremely important to our ecosystem. And in some cases, they're critical to the survival of some of those much more charismatic organisms. I think it's pretty cool that right here, where we live in the eastern U.S., has the highest biodiversity of land snails in all of North America. I also love the fact that land snails are something that all of us can find in our yards and communities if we just take the time to look for them. And maybe that is the point. Just taking some time to slow down, look, and appreciate all the little things that we so often take for granted. In the end, I think Judy had the absolute best quote of the day when she said, "You only protect what you learn to love, and you can only love something if you know its name." That is so true, and it is part of the reason why I do episodes like this, which feature some of those undervalued species. I recognize that I don't know enough about land snails, and I'm as guilty as the next person of overlooking their importance. Hopefully, through conversations like this, I'll be able to learn more and gain a greater appreciation for some of those less well-known organisms. I've definitely been inspired to start looking for and identifying some of the land snails in my area. I hope you have been too. Before I wrap this up, I wanted to let you know that the Backyard Ecology website has a shop where I sell my book and nature-related note cards. If you're interested, please check it out at www.backyardecology.net/shop. Proceeds from the Backyard Ecology shop help support the Backyard Ecology podcast and blog. Until next week, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yards and community.